Okay, we're going to move on to our final speaker of the day. Etgar Lefkovits is a journalist who has published extensively in venues such as Jewish News Syndicate, the Jerusalem Post, and the International New York Times. He worked as an Israel and Middle East Fellow on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and as the Foreign Affairs Director to Israel's Minister for Social Equality. This is the second time that I'll be hosting him here on campus because he always has a very fresh take on the latest things going on. So please welcome Etgar. Thank
you. Thanks very much, Brett, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back here at the University of Illinois. As Brett said, my second talk. But I think that the noxious times that we are now living in over these past 6 months has only proven basically how prescient the idea that you had 6 months ago to hold this conference and gathering here. I'd also, as the last speaker, and on behalf of, I think, all the speakers and also all the participants, I'd like to voice my appreciation to the law enforcement officials who are with us today. And our thanks for protecting the community, not just today, but every day. Now, I'd like to start by saying, in an opening, that the veteran CBS News anchor, Dan Rather, once said, "If it bleeds, it leads." And how true are those remarks until today? And at the risk of wearing rose-tinted glasses for a minute, but not in any way seeking to downplay the seriousness and the devastating events and the difficult events that have happened over the last 6 months and the deep challenges that lie ahead, I would like to touch upon, in the next few minutes, some of the underreported stories or overlooked stories that have made the news during this most trying and difficult period. So I'm going to break with the usual of just talking about the same. Now, as you know, for years, even among the more moderate Arab leaders in the region, for both security reasons and also for political reasons, it was one thing to say things in public and quite something else to say things in private. But now, in ways as never seen before, we are seeing a major change, a monumental change, and these changes are coming out in the open. The adage, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," is proving itself today more than ever before. And so, to the most important headline, which you will not read anywhere, I will argue that what we are seeing now in the wake of the Hamas attack is a tectonic shift of changed alliances in the Middle East and beyond. What was long said behind closed doors and rarely reported in the media, but burst out in the open following the October 7 massacre, and particularly after last month's unprecedented Iranian attack on Israel, in which, as you know, the Islamic Republic fired over 300 drones and missiles at the Jewish state, unmasking their direct involvement in terrorism, which had previously been masked and carried out by proxies. What we are seeing now is a major shakeup in the alliances in the region. And perhaps nothing better illustrates that than what happened exactly after the Iranian attack. And as you know, it was sort of a mix of Star Wars and a science fiction movie. Why is that? Because in addition to the major success of Israel and the US and the Allies in self-defense and the missile defense system in shooting down all of these projectiles, what you also had, and what was reported, if hushed up, was various Arab countries in the region cooperating, and not just cooperating, but openly siding with Israel in the war. For example, you had neighboring Jordan, which was interesting because Jordan has always had a close security cooperation with Israel, but it's always been completely hushed up for obvious reasons because of the makeup of the population in Jordan, which is predominantly Palestinian. But during this attack on Israel, Jordan shot down the missiles that were coming towards neighboring Israel. And they did this despite warnings from Iran that if you do this and if you take part in this if you take part in shooting down the missiles against Israel, we will attack you. Well, guess what? They didn't pay any attention. They actually said, oh, well, we had to do this because we were afraid that the missiles were going to land in Amman. Of course, that wasn't the case, but never mind. That was their response, and they went ahead and took part. In addition to Jordan, you also had Saudi Arabia. This is a major breaking news story. You had Saudi Arabia, in addition, in this alliance, together with Israel, together with Jordan, taking part and shooting down these missiles. This is huge. And it just encapsulates the changed alliances that you heard about in the back doors, in the back door rooms that were chatted about, but never before come out so much in the open. If some of you might remember, in years past, there were hints of this. In WikiLeaks, when the king of Saudi Arabia came out and spoke against an Iranian nuclear-armed Iran, there was also remarks that the ambassador of the UAE once made at a conference, at the Aspen conference in Colorado, talking about you have to cut off the head of the snake. There was also a revealing interview by the president of Egypt, Sisi, who once spoke about, in a very revealing interview with CBS's 60 Minutes, he once spoke about how he allows, and not only allows, but he encourages the Israeli military, the Israeli Air Force, to carry out targeted attacks against ISIS in the Sinai Desert. So those were all hints of things that you almost never heard about because they certainly didn't make A1 on the pages of the New York Times or elsewhere, because they were on the back pages. They weren't said publicly. But now everything has come out in the open. In addition, what's so phenomenally interesting is that this relationship is also so important because don't forget that one of the major reasons that that Hamas carried out the attacks of October 7 was because they were afraid that a peace deal was soon to be agreed upon between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which would be a game changer for the whole region. So this was their raison d'etre. This was their main reason for the timing, certainly, of the attack on October 7. And here we are seeing 6 months later, despite and in spite of everything, that there's still this possibility in the offing. And there's still these glimmers of hope of what can be and what will be in the future. So despite this, and in spite of this, we see the major changes. And what's also interesting is, don't forget that here today you talked about all this anti-Semitism and delegitimization going on worldwide and at campuses, but this is such a major shift, for example, that we're seeing that it will, if there's delegitimization, this whole basis of the delegitimization campaign will be burst out completely and exploded and brought to nothing when you see countries such as Saudi Arabia making peace with Israel. This is huge. Now, in addition, what I would also like to touch upon is what's happening with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and the other countries in the Gulf that have quietly made peace with Israel as part of the Abraham Accords, as you know, that were signed several years ago. This is also huge, huge development in the region, which is still taking place and growing quietly, minute by minute, day by day. First of all, when you're talking about the United Arab Emirates, they and Bahrain, they have quietly supported Israel in the whole 6 months of the war with Hamas. They're rooting for Israel. Maybe they won't say so publicly. This won't be on CNN, but they are rooting for Israel, and they are rooting for the defeat of Hamas. What's even more revealing is one of the stories. Oh, and an example of that, by the way, is how are they continuing their relations with Israel? Even at the height of the war, in the first weeks, when major foreign airlines canceled all their flights to Israel, including all the American carriers, United, Delta, American Airlines, and all the major European carriers canceled, and only a few stayed. It was so revealing that the carriers from the United Arab Emirates continued flying to Israel all during the war. So we're not talking about Israel's national carrier El Al, which of course continued to fly, but we're talking about the carriers that are based in Dubai and based in Abu Dhabi. So this was a huge sign that they're determined to keep the peace. And not only to keep the peace, but to nurture the relations. So how revealing was that? And this was something that basically unimaginable, unfathomable just some years ago. And this line has proven so popular, before the war and in the wake of the Abraham Accords, that you had something like over 1 million Israelis, that's about 10% of the whole public, visiting the United Arab Emirates in the several years since the peace was made. Huge. And here's another example that didn't get much international coverage, and I would say barely got any international coverage, but was a story that I broke. Despite the war, and in spite of the war, there has been now created a land corridor where cargo is shipped from the United Arab Emirates through Saudi Arabia and Jordan to Israel. And this is something which is so unbelievable that it happened before the war, but it actually gathered steam during the war. And what's so interesting about this is yet another example of the changed alliances in the region, because it shows you that despite and in spite of all the propaganda, all the half-truths, and all the hate that's out there on social media, these countries are determined to keep the peace and to further the peace. And what I'd like to say is so revealing that this happened, and this came out even during the war, because don't forget that the Houthis, which were one of Iran's proxies, were carrying out attacks against the vessels that went by ship, by boat. So this land route actually became even more popular than before the war, in addition to cutting down time and cutting down costs, but it also became a security measure. So how revealing is that? And then, after this happened, not only was obviously, if you know your geography and you look at the map, you see that it necessarily had to pass through Saudi Arabia and Jordan, but Egypt also wanted to sign in on this agreement. And they actually, during the war, quietly signed an agreement that these cargo would also go on to Egypt. So this shows you the changed alliances and the different alliances in the Middle East and beyond. Huge, huge development and huge potential for the future. And how revealing is that? And then, after this happened, not only was obviously, if you know your geography and you look at the map, you see that it necessarily had to pass through Saudi Arabia and Jordan, but Egypt also wanted to sign in on this agreement. And they actually, during the war, quietly signed an agreement that these cargo would also go on to Egypt. So this shows you the changed alliances and the different alliances in the Middle East and beyond. Huge, huge development and huge potential for the future. And how some things are done quietly, some things are done less quietly, but this is something that is really something to keep an eye on, the potential for the development in the relations between all of these countries in the region that have shared common values now in working together against Islamic extremism. Another point that I would like to share, you also have something very interesting. Some of the previous speakers spoke about or hinted about in passing the importance of education. Because I always say, when people talk about solving the conflict, or at least resolving the conflict, or at least managing the conflict, that at the bottom line is education. It all begins with education. Education, 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 tolerance and respect for the other. So how revealing is it that at a time not only of Holocaust denial, but now also you have October 7 denial, that in the United Arab Emirates, an Arab country, you now have Holocaust education. This is something which is totally new, totally phenomenal, and totally a game changer for the future generations. And if you look back again at all the hate that's taught in textbooks, and we know this, and all the misinformation and disinformation, and how many of these in Palestinian classrooms, they don't even have Israel on the map. In the United Arab Emirates, they're actually starting recently to learn about the Holocaust as part of the state curriculum. And this is spreading to Bahrain also. And there is a pilot, at least it got frozen by the war, but the organizers, who are a Canadian Israeli entrepreneur and his local partner in Abu Dhabi, also wanted to do this in other countries in the region that are signatories to the Abraham Accords. So stay tuned, because that part has been obviously frozen because of the war. But it's just indicative of the changed alliances. Something else which is also very, very important, and again, you don't hear much about this in the press. Last year, just shortly before the war, when everybody was still focused on other things, there was a major development, major diplomatic development, which was overshadowed, and I dare say, barely reported in the international press. And this was Azerbaijan, a Shiite Muslim country, opened an embassy in Israel. This was a historic moment because they became the first Shiite Muslim country to open a diplomatic mission in Israel. This is also huge because it shows you the changed alliances even beyond the Middle East. Now, these relations, at least with Azerbaijan, have been for decades covert. They obviously share a border with a common enemy. They have a 400+ mile border, if you look on the map, with a certain country that begins with an I, that's not Israel. And they also actually provide about 30% of the oil that Israel buys to Israel. But what happened was that after decades of close, covert ties, last year, this too burst out in the open. And it went ahead, despite threats from Iran that don't you dare do this. And there have actually been on Azerbaijani soil, both in Baku, their capital, and at their embassy in Tehran, there's been attacks by Iranians against the Azerbaijanis because of this, against a leading parliamentarian, against their embassy. And you know what? They didn't care. They went ahead. They did it. And as recently as several months ago, the president of Azerbaijan met with the president of Israel. In the midst of this whole difficult period of the war, they met on the sidelines of a conference in Europe, and they both expressed their determination to continue to work together and improve the strategic alliance. So again, these are huge, huge developments which foreshadow and portend a much different future. I would like to say that what we're seeing today around the world, the two various camps here are at play, and the two very diverse visions of what can be for the future. Now, I have to share with you also my cardinal rule number one about the Middle East. Cardinal rule number one about the Middle East is it's always dangerous to predict what will happen next. And anyone who tells you that they know for sure is either hopelessly naive at best or fecklessly foolish at worst. We really don't know how this is all going to play out. But what we can say for sure is that we are seeing this major shift. These are the long terms. In the long term, major shift, and major change in the alliances in the region. I think it's also important to share, someone also mentioned here, Bernard Lewis, I think the previous speaker. Bernard Lewis once said, Professor Emeritus of Princeton University, that after decades of on and off peace negotiations, he came to the conclusion that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not fundamentally a territorial conflict over land, or it would have long been solved, but rather it's an existential conflict over Israel's right to exist in the Middle East. So while the Israeli-Palestinian conflict attracts the attention, and currently obviously now with this devastating war against Hamas, it would be wrong to look at the conflict in isolation from the larger regional contrast as we talked about. And the shifting alliances which we discussed may eventually play a major role in actually diffusing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As the Middle East changes, if the forces of democracy triumph, then the atmosphere will change and may be one that can become more conducive to compromise. So this is a very open question as the history of the Middle East unfolds before our very eyes. And in conclusion, I would like to again return to my beginning point. Despite the dire news coming out of the region and the difficult news, it's very incomplete and incorrect to paint a picture of what's going on solely of what I call B, D, and G, boom, doom, and gloom, because it's simply not. There are many more things at play behind the scenes. Of course there are challenges. Of course there are difficulties. We're witnessing this now. There are many open questions. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. But what we do know is that when allies stand strong together, and this goes also for what everything was talked about today, when alliances are strengthened, when the good people stand together, then the evil is weakened. And of course the opposite is true. When good people do not stand together, then the bad is strengthened. So let us hope and let us work together to promoting this alliance of good versus evil. Thank you very much.